studio was nearly pitch black, except for the soft orange glow of a single overhead lamp. A reel-to-reel machine spun quietly in the corner, its tape trembling with static anticipation. The grainy audio crackled to life. Muffled voices exchanged low, urgent phrases, thick with tension. Then, out of the shadows came one line. Clear, controlled, laced with something final. "I saw everything. And I recorded it." The room froze. A producer, young, pale, trembling, snatched off his headphones. He looked up at the engineer, mouth slightly open as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The audio continued to hiss, a digital heartbeat echoing in the silence. Nobody said a word. Not yet. The voice on the tape was unmistakable, calm, but nuclear. It was Will Smith, and he wasn't acting. This is not just another celebrity scandal. This is a fracture, a rupture in the carefully constructed illusion of power, respect, and silence that's governed an entire corner of the entertainment industry for decades. Somewhere behind these whispers is a man who built an empire on charm and control, and another man who's finally done staying quiet. Before we go further, a warning. The following documentary contains allegations of abuse, manipulation, and disturbing content. What you are about to hear may be difficult for some viewers. Please proceed with discretion. The tape ends before we hear more. But the damage has already begun. Someone is shaking. Someone else is about to fall. And what was once buried under fame, luxury, and silence is about to be forced into the light. This is the story of what was heard, what was hidden, and what can no longer be ignored. For most of his life, Will Smith has been the embodiment of the American dream. The charming kid from West Philadelphia who turned a goofy sitcom into a global phenomenon, then catapulted himself into the rarest tier of Hollywood royalty. He was the Fresh Prince, the box office king, the family man who could make you laugh, cry, and believe in goodness. All in one scene. America didn't just like Will Smith, it trusted him. He was our clean-cut superstar, untouched by scandal, radiating a relentless optimism even when the world darkened around him. You'd hear Oprah call him one of the most inspiring souls I've ever known. Ellen would call him pure light. And on Oscar night, crowds stood as he received the highest honor an actor can get. Tears in his eyes, hands trembling. "This is a beautiful moment," he said that night. But few realized how much pain was hiding beneath the polish, and how much more was to come. Then there's Sean Combs, Diddy, Puff Daddy, a name that became an empire, a movement, a shadow. If Will Smith was the hero of the red carpet, Diddy was its architect, the kingmaker behind the curtain. From Biggie Smalls to MTV domination, from fashion lines to Forbes lists, he was the mogul who moved like smoke. Always present, always powerful, but impossible to pin down. Diddy owns the room. One journalist wrote in 2003, he changed hip-hop. He redefined hustle. He built something permanent out of nothing. But behind the flashing lights and champagne toasts, rumors always lurked. About loyalty, about silence, about the price of being in Diddy's orbit. Side by side, they seemed like polar opposites. Will, the moral compass. Diddy, the ruthless builder. One gave comfort, the other gave orders. But in truth, they were two sides of the same coin, each navigating an industry built on image, control, and secrets. For years, their paths crossed quietly, privately. But somewhere along the way, that quiet turned into something else. Because behind every perfect smile, there's something unseen. And sometimes, image isn't just a mask. It's a shield, one that's starting to crack. Before the world knew him as a leading man, before he walked onto red carpets in custom tuxedos and million-dollar smiles, Will Smith was just a kid with a beat machine and a big dream. In the late 80s, he emerged from the streets of West Philadelphia with infectious charisma and lyrical precision, becoming one half of the Grammy-winning duo DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. His rhymes were clean, his image safe, his energy radiant. He wasn't like the others in rap. He was the kid you brought home to your parents, and that made him marketable. Hollywood took notice. And the transformation began. In 1990, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air exploded onto TV screens, launching Will from rising musician to mainstream icon almost overnight. But beneath the humor and high tops was something more fragile. A young man carrying unresolved pain. Will had spoken, years later, about watching his father hit his mother, about the rage he swallowed and the perfectionism it bred. "I became a pleaser," he once said. If I made everyone laugh, no one would hit anyone. It was survival through performance, and it worked. But the cost was already building. As Will's fame accelerated, so did the expectations. The studio saw him as their golden child, handsome, relatable, bankable. But the pressure to maintain that image was relentless. Every role was calculated, every interview rehearsed. Behind every joke was a man who feared the whole thing could collapse if he stopped smiling. The entertainment industry didn't just elevate Will, it absorbed him. He was taught, quietly and repeatedly, that silence kept you safe, that rocking the boat could sink the ship. It was in that dizzying, gilded haze of early stardom that he crossed paths with Sean Diddy Combs. It was the 1990s. Hip-hop was not just music, it was the culture. Diddy was rising fast, orchestrating an empire with Bad Boy Records, holding court at industry parties that felt like coronations. Will, now transitioning into film, was a different kind of star, but the circles overlapped. Music, power, fame. The two men began to orbit each other, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, forming what looked from the outside like mutual respect. But there were things about those parties, about the atmosphere, that stayed with Will long after the music faded. Grand mansions, guarded doors, eyes that watched too closely. There were rooms you didn't enter unless invited. Rules no one spoke, but everyone followed. There was opulence, yes, but also something unnerving beneath it. A pressure in the air that made your skin prickle. You didn't question it. You just played your part. Will never said anything publicly. He couldn't. The stakes were too high. He was building a career on trust. Family-friendly movies, interviews about love and discipline, a carefully curated narrative of the ideal man. To even suggest discomfort with what he saw behind closed doors would mean opening himself to scrutiny, to judgment, to punishment from the very industry that had built him. So he smiled. He signed. He showed up when asked. And slowly, a new kind of silence settled over him, not the one born from trauma, but one born from complicity. Because when you're protecting an image, sometimes you protect the wrong things. Sometimes you look away when something feels off. Sometimes you convince yourself that if you didn't see it clearly, it didn't happen. But it did happen, and he remembered every second. What Will didn't know was that his silence, his desire to protect everything he'd built, was being watched, calculated, and one day, it would be weaponized. It always started the same way. An invitation, exclusive and impossible to decline. A mansion in the hills, a velvet rope after party, a private event, just for family. The kind of thing you only get invited to if you've made it. And by the early 2000s, Will Smith had made it. He was no longer just a star, he was a pillar of the culture. But even then, he knew there were spaces in the industry that shimmered with something dangerous. Places where the air itself felt rehearsed. These weren't the parties you saw on TMZ. These were private, controlled, guarded not just by security, but by silence. Models floated through candlelit halls like ghosts. Liquor flowed like truth serum. And in certain wings of the house, the music quieted and the rules changed. Diddy's gatherings were infamous in whispers. Extravagant, opulent, and intensely secretive. For some, they were playgrounds of power. For others, pressure cookers. You didn't say no to Diddy, not if you wanted to stay in the room. And for years, Will didn't say no. Not out of desire, but out of necessity. He wasn't like them. He didn't indulge the same way. He'd come, he'd smile, he'd leave. But the longer he stayed in the orbit, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that things were off. There were rooms people entered and didn't return from the same. Celebrities arrived with entourages and left alone, disheveled, disturbed. Eyes darted. Laughter sometimes felt forced. Will had mastered the art of reading a room, and something in these rooms felt like a performance no one had rehearsed for. Then came the night. It wasn't the first time he'd attended one of Diddy's exclusive post-award parties, but it would be the last. That night, something shifted. What exactly happened has never been confirmed, and perhaps never will be. But sources close to Will described a moment, something he saw, or perhaps heard, that shattered the carefully built boundary between observer and participant. He left early, visibly shaken, and for weeks afterward, he was different. Quieter, distracted, paranoid, some said. Years later, a rumor surfaced, a recording, an audio file, something captured during one of those nights. Not staged, not consented to, but real. And it wasn't Diddy speaking. It was Will. A voice filled with disbelief, confusion, and what sounded like fear. The tape never went public, not then, but the whispers started. Executives became cautious around Diddy. Publicists for major stars started declining invitations to his parties. Will, once one of the most open, charismatic faces in Hollywood, began to withdraw. Interviews became more guarded. Behind the scenes, he was less present. Something had changed. The blackmail theory gained traction in dark corners of the industry. That Will had been recorded, that he had seen too much, that someone, maybe Diddy, was holding onto something that kept him quiet. The theory wasn't just gossip. There were sudden changes in deals, canceled projects, brand hesitations that no one could explain. One insider whispered to a journalist off the record, Will knew. He saw, and he couldn't say a word, not without burning it all down. And Diddy, he moved like nothing had happened. If he was aware of the tape, he gave no sign. He continued expanding his empire. K-Rock, Revolt, real estate, more awards, more press. But something in his demeanor hardened. He was still the life of the party, but his eyes watched more closely now. His circle tightened. He began removing people, quietly, strategically, anyone who might know too much or had been too close to that night. "You don't cross Diddy," one producer said in a leaked email. "You disappear." For Will, it wasn't just fear of retaliation. It was fear of collapse, of losing everything he'd built. His family, his legacy, his reputation as Hollywood's good man. Because in an industry where perception is the product, even the hint of scandal can destroy you. But what happens when staying silent becomes its own kind of betrayal? When protecting your image means burying the truth? Will was never naive. He knew what the industry demanded. But that night had changed something fundamental. He began journaling more. He stopped showing up to certain events. He started asking questions, quietly, discreetly, but always watching. And deep within the walls of his home, he began recording things. Not to share, not yet, but to remember. To protect himself, to be ready. Because one day, the silence would end. One day, the cost of staying quiet would outweigh the fear of speaking. And when that day came, the tape wouldn't just be evidence. It would be a reckoning. They say pressure doesn't just break people, it reveals what's been broken for a long time. For Will Smith, the cracks were years in the making. From the outside, he still sparkled. Oscar nominations, best-selling memoirs, viral social media videos with perfectly edited smiles. But beneath the surface, the man who once danced through life with effortless charm was unraveling. Slowly, quietly. And no one really saw it. Not until the slap. March 27th, 2022, the night of the 94th Academy Awards. A night that should have been a culmination of Will's cinematic legacy, a long overdue Oscar win, but it was something else entirely. One joke, one moment, one slap across Chris Rock's face that echoed around the world. The headlines exploded. Will loses control. From Fresh Prince to Violent King. Think pieces flooded every platform. People debated comedy, masculinity, marriage, race, but very few stopped to ask, why did this man, always known for control, break that night? Because it wasn't just about a joke. It was about years of unspoken things rotting beneath the surface. It was about protecting someone, something, anything, after being forced to protect the wrong people for too long. It was rage that didn't belong to that moment alone. It belonged to every moment he'd buried the truth, every time he'd smiled through discomfort, every night he came home from those parties and tried to forget what he couldn't unsee. In interviews after the Oscars, Will's mask began to slip. He spoke of emotional blindness, of being a vessel for other people's expectations. He apologized to the world, but there was a heaviness behind his eyes, a weight he didn't explain. In his memoir, he wrote about being haunted by his need to please, by guilt, by silence. I had never really confronted the real damage done to me, he admitted, because to do that, I'd have to speak. But he wasn't ready. Not then. In the months that followed the slap, the consequences were swift. Brands that once clamored to be associated with Will began pulling back. Netflix paused projects. Studio deals stalled. Once adored by all sides of Hollywood, urban, mainstream, young, old, Will was suddenly radioactive. The punishment wasn't just public, it was surgical. Quiet disinvitations, PR firms switching clients. He was no longer safe. And still, Diddy said nothing. At first, his silence felt neutral, just another mogul watching from the sidelines. But to some insiders, the silence spoke volumes, because by now, the whispers were getting louder. That there was more to Will's spiral than a joke about his wife. That there was history, real, documented history that hadn't yet surfaced. And Diddy? He was moving cautiously. Fewer public appearances, statements filtered through assistants, eyes on him but nothing sticking. Yet, meanwhile, Will began to change. He withdrew from the spotlight. He stopped oversharing on social media. He started attending therapy regularly, openly. He hinted in interviews that he was unpacking things from long ago. He talked about trauma, not just his own, but the industry's. About how silence gets mistaken for strength, how healing begins when the mask comes off. Still, he never named names. Not yet. But those close to him noticed the shift. He was no longer just protecting his image. He was protecting something deeper. Himself. His truth. The fragments of dignity he still had after decades of bending for the machine. Because Will Smith had reached the edge. And the next step was either collapse or confession. And he knew, if he chose to speak, he wouldn't be the only one who'd fall. It began as a rumor. A whisper passed from inbox to inbox, buried inside vague tweets and blind items. But then, like lightning in a dry forest, it struck. A cryptic file uploaded to an obscure site on the dark web. Low quality, short, but unmistakably real. A voice. His voice. Will Smith. The audio was grainy, like it had been pulled from the shadows. No music, no editing, just breath, silence. Then a sentence that changed everything. I saw what you did, and I have it all. You'll never touch me again. And that was it. No names were mentioned, no timestamps, no context, but the voice was sharp, controlled, a fury trembling just beneath the calm. And in the seconds that followed the leak, the world held its breath. Reddit threads detonated. Is this the recording? Was this the night he left that party early? Is this why he went quiet? Screenshots spread like wildfire across X, formerly Twitter. Old clips of Diddy and Will joking at award shows were reposted with chilling new meaning. TikTok investigators matched the cadence of Will's voice to his past interviews using AI tools to verify authenticity. Within 24 hours, the file had been scrubbed from most mainstream platforms. DMCA strikes hit YouTube channels. Blogs that had reposted it suddenly deleted their articles, citing legal concerns. But the damage was already done. The genie wasn't just out of the bottle, it was shouting into a megaphone. Will didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. His team issued no statement. His social media went dark. But something had clearly cracked open, and the silence around Diddy began to shake. A former bad boy artist, long disappeared from the public eye, resurfaced on an anonymous live stream. His face blurred, voice altered, but what he said rang with painful clarity. Everybody knew, he said, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it. We all knew there were tapes. There were cameras. That's how Diddy kept people in line. You smile, you play the game, or you vanish. Will tried to leave the table, but the game followed him. The live stream was taken down hours later, but not before it was clipped, reposted, and stitched into 1,000 different TikToks. His words became gospel to the theorists. The game followed him. Behind the scenes, a Hollywood producer, speaking under condition of anonymity, told an investigative podcast that the file had been passed between hands for years. Not for sale, not for extortion, as insurance. It's been locked in vaults, encrypted, protected. Will recorded it himself, not for anyone else, but for survival. He knew if anything ever happened to him, it would be his last word, a final card to play. And now, someone had played it. Theories spiraled. Was this what destroyed their relationship? Was this why Will became distant? Had Diddy known this moment would come? Was that why certain journalists had suddenly gone quiet? What was once dismissed as conspiracy now felt like a countdown. Old interviews with Will resurfaced. Clips where he'd said, "There's a lot I've been quiet about." Others where he talked about people using charm to hide darkness. Hindsight re-edited everything. And as the internet dissected every second of the recording, one emotion rose above the rest. Betrayal. Not just of Will, but of a culture. A generation that had idolized both men, that had danced to Diddy's music and laughed with Will's movies. A generation forced to ask itself what it had been clapping for all these years, because if the voice note was real, then the mask was off, and Hollywood's two biggest smiles had just become evidence. The room was small, private, no studio lights, no audience clapping on cue. Just 2 microphones, a wooden table, and a conversation that wasn't supposed to leave the vault. But it did. The podcast was hosted by a longtime friend of Will's, someone outside the Hollywood machine. A safe space, or so it seemed. No press release, no teaser clips, just a deep, raw, unfiltered conversation recorded in quiet defiance. When the episode leaked, it was already too late to pull it back. A recording ripped and re-uploaded across Telegram groups, Twitter circles, private Discord servers. People didn't just listen. They leaned in like they were hearing gospel. Will never said Diddy's name, but he didn't have to. His voice was slow, weighted, measured like someone walking a tightrope made of trauma. I spent a long time thinking I was crazy, he said, that maybe I had imagined it, that maybe power meant I didn't have the right to be disgusted. But there was a night when I realized it wasn't just wrong, it was evil. The host asked softly if he'd ever felt unsafe. Will didn't blink. Not just unsafe, trapped, betrayed, surrounded by people who smiled in my face and sold my silence behind closed doors. He paused, breathing shallow. And the man who orchestrated it all, he wears success like armor. But monsters don't need claws when they have charm. The audio cracked as the emotions swelled in his throat. It wasn't performance, it was exorcism. Legal murmurs came within hours. Sean Combs' legal team issued a cease and desist letter to the podcast host. They called the statements defamatory, reckless, and inciting. They threatened millions in damages. But it was too late. The floodgates weren't just open. They had burst. The public didn't need Will to say the name. They already knew. The internet filled in the gaps with surgical precision, matching timelines, dates, known party appearances. Even tabloid reporters who had previously defended Diddy began to tread cautiously, hedging their language. The old invincibility was cracking. And then came the line. The one quote that made it onto every news channel, every carousel post, every TikTok and YouTube thumbnail. Some men build kingdoms out of silence. But silence ends when the truth speaks. It wasn't just a mic drop, it was a death knell. For years, Diddy had been untouchable. A mogul, a billionaire, a tastemaker. But now, he was a name surrounded by smoke. And Will? For the first time in decades, he wasn't the joke, the clown, the people pleaser. He was the witness. The courtroom hadn't been assembled yet, but the testimony had already begun. It happened fast, like a match to gasoline. Within hours of the podcast leak, social media detonated into a firestorm. The hashtag number Diddy Exposed shot to the top of trending charts across X, TikTok, and Instagram. But it wasn't just a digital storm. It was a reckoning decades in the making. On TikTok, creators pieced together clips like detectives in a digital courtroom. Videos slowed to 0.25x speed, analyzing handshakes, glances, body language. Theories became timelines. Timelines became patterns. Suddenly, interviews from 20 years ago felt sinister in hindsight. A laugh too forced, a shoulder touch that lingered too long, a moment where Will's face would freeze, just for a second, when Diddy entered the room. YouTube exploded with reaction videos. From casual culture commentators to full-blown investigative breakdowns, everyone had a take. Some videos pulled millions of views in mere hours, with thumbnails that read, "Will warned us." The secrets behind Bad Boy's silence? The empire of fear is crumbling. Reddit threads connected the dots with eerie precision. Remember when that assistant mysteriously left? Look at this NDA Diddy made that backup dancer sign. This is bigger than just 2 men. The online world wasn't theorizing anymore. It was prosecuting. And then came the celebrities. 50 Cent, never one to miss an opportunity to stir the pot, posted a cryptic meme on Instagram. A cartoon king sitting alone on a throne made of microphones, looking terrified. The caption? It's always quiet before the collapse. He didn't tag anyone. He didn't have to. Other celebrities were less playful. A-list actors who had once praised Diddy went dark, scrubbing photos, turning off comments, issuing vague statements about protecting your energy. Even longtime industry allies hesitated to defend him. The silence said everything. But then finally, Diddy responded. A single statement issued by his legal team. The allegations circulating in recent days are false, defamatory, and deeply harmful. Mr. Combs has never participated in nor condoned the behaviors being suggested. He will pursue all legal remedies available. It was cold, sanitized, PR polished, and yet it landed with a thud. There was no denial of any specific claim, no emotion, no humanity, just a wall. And for many, that wall felt more like a cage, a place where truth had been imprisoned for years. Worse still, some of Diddy's closest collaborators, the ones who always showed up at parties, always posted birthday tributes, had gone completely radio silent. No comments, no reposts, just absence. And absence, in moments like this, speaks louder than allegiance. The empire Diddy built, once wrapped in gold and platinum, suddenly looked like it was constructed out of shadows. And shadows were disappearing under the light. In a culture addicted to fame, silence had once been the cost of survival. But now, silence was being shattered, and the noise was deafening. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't tweet vengeance. There was no world tour of apologies or tell-all interviews. Will Smith reclaimed himself the only way he knew how, by letting go of the mask. In a rare candid video, grainy, handheld, no music score, he spoke directly to camera. No entourage, no curated background. Just Will, his eyes clear but weathered, as if they'd finally stopped pretending not to see. "I spent too long protecting what didn't protect me," he said. "I wore the smile. I played the part. But some masks don't come off until the soul beneath them can breathe again." There was no mention of names, no specifics, but there didn't need to be. The performance was over. Not the performance the world had applauded for decades, but the one behind it. The performance of silence, of forced peace, of pretending that proximity to power didn't leave bruises you weren't allowed to show. And maybe that was the quiet justice. Not lawsuits, not headlines, but revelation. Because sometimes justice isn't the villain falling, it's the victim rising without needing to push them. The last footage we see is poetic, haunting in its simplicity. Will walks down a long hallway, the kind you find behind the stages of award shows. The camera trails behind him. There's no one else in sight. No cheers, no photographers, just the echo of his footsteps. Steady, grounded. And then he stops, looks up at a closed door, once a symbol of opportunity, access, power. But he doesn't reach for the handle. He turns away. He walks toward the exit, toward the light bleeding in from the back of the building, toward the real world, the unscripted one, the one that doesn't need permission to tell the truth. And as the frame lingers, fading to black, a final line etches across the screen, more felt than spoken. In a world built on soundproof rooms and silent deals, the truth always finds a mic.